Jimmy Kimmel walked into the studio earlier than usual that evening, the quiet hum of the production crew filling the air as they made final adjustments before the taping. It wasn't just any episode. Donald Trump was the guest, and for the first time in a long time, the show felt heavier than its usual satirical rhythm. The moment Jimmy sat down at his desk with a hot mug in his hand and the stage lights hit, he looked up and saw Trump waiting backstage, calm, unusually reserved. For a man who once exchanged public barbs with him, Trump looked like he had something else on his mind. The camera crew gave the cue, the applause sign lit up, and the audience roared as the theme music faded. Jimmy leaned into the mic and smiled, his tone still light but his mind running ahead, trying to read how this night might unfold. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guest is someone you've definitely heard of. He's been on this show more in punchlines than in person, but tonight, he's right here. Please welcome the 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump. As Trump stepped onto the stage, the applause was mixed, some cheers, some awkward claps, but Jimmy kept his composure, even as he stood and shook Trump's hand. The handshake was firm, not forced, and there was a moment, just a flicker, where their eyes locked and both men seemed to silently acknowledge the weight of years of back and forth. Jimmy invited him to sit and slid into his own chair, still trying to ease into what felt like the most emotionally charged interview he'd ever done. The usual playful sarcasm was hard to reach for tonight. Jimmy began, "Well, Mr. Trump, welcome to the show. I guess pigs really do fly." That got a few laughs, and even Trump cracked a half smile, but he nodded slowly and replied, "Yeah, well, even pigs have something to say sometimes." That was how the night began, not with explosions, but with a slow unraveling of something more human. They spoke about politics briefly, brushing over recent events with jabs and tension laced in every sentence. But soon, the conversation turned. Jimmy asked, "Is there ever a moment you sit back and wonder about the people, not just the polls? Like the things that keep people up at night, not the ones running campaigns, but the ones just trying to get through life?" Trump leaned back, his hand folding over his lap as he paused. "You know, Kimmel, I used to think the world only made sense in deals and numbers. I used to think strong meant loud. But I lost people too. I lost friends. I've seen veterans come home broken. I've had to sit with grieving families who don't want to hear about winning. They want to be heard." The audience had grown quieter, and Jimmy wasn't smiling anymore. His fingers tapped lightly on the desk as he nodded. "That's not the man people expect to hear from," he said softly. Trump's voice didn't raise. "People expect a show. But I'm tired of the show, Jimmy." And just like that, the tone had shifted. They went on for another 20 minutes, talking about empathy, about how it feels to be judged every day and misunderstood. At one point, Jimmy said, "I used to make fun of you like it was my job, and maybe sometimes I forgot you were human too." Trump didn't fire back. He just looked at him and said, "I get it. I really do, but it matters more now to just talk like this. Not shout, not accuse. Just talk." By then, Jimmy had grown visibly more emotional, his hands no longer fidgeting but simply resting on the desk, his eyes misted. And when Trump looked at him and said, "You know, I watched you during the pandemic. I saw you break down when talking about your son. I respected that. That was real. That's what people need to see more of." There was silence. Jimmy blinked, looked away for a second, then back at Trump, his voice low but sincere. "Nobody ever says stuff like that to me. Especially not you." The crowd didn't erupt. There wasn't a punchline. Just a soft, shared silence. And as they cut to commercial, Jimmy reached for his mug and quietly wiped at the corner of his eye. No tears spilled, but the camera caught enough. It wasn't a meltdown. It was just human. The crew saw it. The audience felt it. And for once, the man known for political satire and late-night burns was sitting across from a man he'd ridiculed for years, both somehow finding ground they never expected to stand on. That was only the beginning. The studio lights dimmed for the commercial break, but the atmosphere didn't reset the way it usually did. Jimmy Kimmel leaned back in his chair, a little quieter than before, his hand still loosely holding the cue cards he no longer needed. Donald Trump sat across from him with his shoulders relaxed, and his voice low as they continued talking off-air in hushed tones that only those on set could hear. Jimmy didn't crack a joke, and Trump didn't throw a jab. For once, it was just two men on a stage, not a show. When the crew gave the 30-second cue, Jimmy turned to Trump and said something that didn't carry sarcasm or irony. "You being here tonight, it means something to me, and maybe to a lot of people watching." Trump gave a small nod, then straightened his blazer and said, "Let's finish strong." The show returned from break, and the applause was softer now, more respectful than before. Jimmy leaned forward and rested his arms on the desk, then looked straight into the camera. "If you're just tuning in, we're here with Donald Trump." Yeah, that Donald Trump. But tonight's conversation has been a little different than usual. We've talked about real things. Not polls, not ratings, but people. Then he turned to Trump and asked, "What made you say yes to coming here? I didn't expect you to ever show up." Trump looked into the crowd for a moment before turning back to Jimmy and said, "Because somewhere along the way I forgot what a conversation felt like. Not a debate, not a rally, just two people talking. And if I've said something to hurt people in the past, maybe this is the moment to try and fix even a piece of it." The audience grew still again. Jimmy nodded slowly and let that sit. "Do you really believe that can happen? That anything can be fixed at this point?" he asked. Trump breathed in deeply, then replied, "Not everything, but maybe something. Maybe if we show that people who disagreed this much can still sit here and try, maybe that opens the door for others. That's the only way forward I see." Jimmy turned to the camera again and said, "Look, I know this isn't what you expected. I didn't expect it either. But I want to say something too. I've made jokes about this man, harsh ones. I thought I was doing my job. But maybe sometimes we forget the power our words carry. And maybe tonight I needed to hear what he said more than I realized." He paused, and the studio air felt thick with emotion. Then he added, "My son watched this show. He's heard me say things. Maybe he'll see this and understand that we're allowed to grow, to change, to forgive." Trump didn't interrupt. He just listened. And when the applause came, it was slower this time. Not the kind for comedy, but for something genuine. Jimmy shifted in his seat and said, "You once called me the worst talk show host in America." Trump grinned for a second and replied, "I did, probably more than once." Jimmy smirked and said, "Well, you might be right some nights. But not tonight. Tonight I think we both did something a little bigger than ratings." The moment lingered as both men looked at each other, not with agreement, but with something closer to respect. It wasn't about politics anymore. It was about what could happen when two people with deep history sat down and left the noise outside. And then the unexpected happened. Trump reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter. He held it in his hand for a few seconds, then passed it across the desk. Jimmy looked at it, then back at Trump. "What is this?" he asked. Trump replied, "Something I wrote on the plane here. I wasn't sure if I was going to read it out loud or just hand it to you." Jimmy unfolded the letter. His eyes scanned the lines slowly. He didn't read it aloud, but his eyes started to glisten. He looked up and said, "I didn't expect this. Not from you." Trump leaned forward and said, "I meant every word. Because when we lose the ability to talk, we lose the ability to feel. And when we lose that, we've lost everything." Jimmy held the letter in both hands and let out a quiet breath. This is probably the most real moment I've had on this stage." The lights above dimmed slightly, and the band stayed silent. There were no exit jokes, no witty send-off. Just a quiet stillness as the show closed with Jimmy looking into the camera one last time and saying, "Tonight reminded me why I started this job. Not to mock or divide, but to connect." No matter who you are, no matter what you believe. If you're watching this at home, I hope you remember that people can still surprise you. They surprised me tonight, and just like that, the screen faded to black. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was full of something more important. The set had gone quiet after the final segment, but the emotional weight of the conversation still hung in the air like an echo that refused to fade. As the audience slowly exited the studio, many of them looked back one more time at the two men still seated on stage. Jimmy Kimmel wasn't in a rush to leave, and neither was Donald Trump. They remained where they were, caught in the aftermath of something they both knew had meant more than just a segment on late-night television. The cameras were off now. No applause, no punchlines, just a soft hum from the stage lights and a few quiet footsteps from the crew. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, holding the folded letter in his hands, and said without looking up, "You know, I don't know if I'll ever read this aloud on another show. But I will read it again, probably 100 times." Trump, sitting with a calmness that felt unusual but welcome, simply nodded and replied, "It wasn't written for the crowd, just for you." That small sentence struck Jimmy more than he thought it would. For a man who had built an empire on large crowds, Trump had chosen a quiet message, and that decision said more than a speech ever could. One of the producers walked up and quietly asked if they wanted the lights brought down. Jimmy waved him off and then looked at Trump. "It's kind of strange, isn't it? That this happened here, on this stage. I thought if we ever met, it'd be fireworks and arguments and walk-offs. Not this." Trump gave a slight shrug and said, "I thought the same. But maybe we both had enough of the yelling. Maybe tonight we remembered there's a person behind every punchline." Jimmy glanced at him and gave a quiet laugh. "That sounds like something I would have said. But yeah, maybe you're right." The two of them sat in that still moment, as if they were letting the noise of the outside world settle before stepping back into it. Jimmy finally stood up, letters still in hand, and Trump did the same. There wasn't a handshake, not yet. But the space between them no longer carried tension. It felt like mutual understanding had taken its place. Jimmy turned toward the empty seats where the audience had sat just moments ago and said, "You know, there's a part of me that still doesn't believe this happened. Like I'm gonna wake up and realize we never had this talk." Trump chuckled and said, "Well, if it was a dream, you're the one that booked me." They both laughed, but the laughter wasn't forced. It was honest. And for two men who had come to define two very different corners of America's conversation, that shared laugh was maybe the most powerful thing of the night. Jimmy motioned toward the back hallway and said, "Let's grab a coffee in the green room. No cameras, just a real talk." Trump agreed without hesitation and followed him backstage where the lighting was softer and the energy more grounded. Inside the green room, Jimmy poured them both coffee and handed one over. "No decaf tonight," he said with a tired smile. Trump took it and replied, "Good, I need something real." They both sat down again, this time on a couch instead of behind a desk. Jimmy took a sip and asked, "Why now? Why this show? You could have picked any platform. Why walk into the lion's den?" Trump stared into the cup for a second and said, "Because this is where it mattered most. I knew it'd be hard. I knew you'd have questions. But I also knew you were fair in your own way. Sharp, but fair. And maybe I needed to hear some things too." Jimmy didn't respond right away. He just nodded slowly, then looked at the wall lined with photos of past guests and said, "I've had some of the biggest names in this room. But tonight will stick with me more than all the others. Not because of who you are, but because of what you said. And maybe what I realized while you were saying it." Trump leaned forward slightly, his expression serious now. "There's still time," he said. "Not for everything, but for something. We can't undo the past, but we can shape what happens next." Jimmy looked up and met his eyes. "You actually believe that?" Trump gave a half smile and said, "I do now." The room grew quiet again, not awkward, but thoughtful. The kind of silence that comes from two people absorbing the weight of what's just been shared. Jimmy set his cup down and rubbed his hands together. I think I need to say something before you leave. And I'm not saying it for TV. I'm saying it because I mean it. You changed tonight, or maybe I changed. I don't know. But this talk, it gave me something I didn't expect. Hope. Trump nodded. Not the political nod, not the stage version of himself, but the version that had let the walls drop for just a little while. Then it was worth it, he said. Jimmy stood up and this time extended his hand. Thank you for that, he said. Trump took it and shook it with a quiet sincerity. They didn't smile, they didn't pose. They just stood there in the small room, two men who had clashed for years finally finding common ground. As Trump headed for the exit, Jimmy called out one last time, if you ever want to come back, the door's open. But only if we skip the talking points. Trump looked over his shoulder and said, only if you skip the jokes. Jimmy gave a soft laugh and said, I'll try. As the door closed behind him, Jimmy sat back down and looked at the letter once more. He unfolded it again. Not to read it, just to hold it, just to feel the moment again. He wasn't crying this time, but the tears he'd shed earlier still lingered behind his eyes. They weren't tears of pain or sadness. They were tears of understanding, of surprise, of the rare kind of peace that comes when you least expect it. And somewhere in that quiet green room, Jimmy Kimmel knew something had shifted. Not just in the show, but in himself. The next morning, Jimmy Kimmel walked into the studio earlier than usual. The place was still quiet, dim lights casting long shadows across the empty audience seats. The night before played back in his head over and over, not as a blur, but with every word sharp, every silence louder than applause. He headed to his office, coffee in hand, and sat down at his desk, glancing at the envelope that now rested next to his keyboard. The letter, Trump's letter, he hadn't put it away. He hadn't wanted to, not yet. He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the wall where photos of past interviews hung, all frozen moments of laughter, shock, outrage, sometimes all three. But there was no photo of last night yet. No still frame could capture that kind of shift. It wasn't about politics. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about seeing someone as a person for the first time after years of caricature. And for Jimmy, it was also about recognizing how much of himself he had built on that same tension. Later that afternoon, producers filed in. No one brought it up at first. But it was there, in every glance, every slightly longer pause in conversation. Eventually Sarah, his lead producer, spoke up. That moment, last night. People are talking. Not just about what was said, but how you handled it. How you both handled it. Jimmy nodded, slowly sipping his coffee. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a stunt. He came in different, and I didn't expect it. She hesitated a second before sitting across from him. Do you want to talk about it on air? Say something to the audience? Jimmy thought for a long moment. He wasn't sure. Not because he didn't want to, but because he wasn't sure how. Let's wait, he finally said. Let's just let it breathe. Let the moment speak for itself a little longer. But as the hours passed, the messages started flooding in. Viewers posting clips, quoting pieces of the letter, expressing surprise, even gratitude. Not for agreement, but for civility. For seeing two people with heavy history drop their guard and speak without rehearsed anger. The internet, for once, wasn't just echoing outrage. Something softer had entered the feed. By the time the show aired that night, the energy in the room was different. The crowd came in buzzing, yes, but also unsure of what to expect. Jimmy stepped out onto the stage with his usual stride, but something in his tone was calmer when he started. Last night, he said, something happened here that I didn't see coming. And I think maybe that's the best kind of thing that can happen on television. He didn't recap it all. He didn't replay every moment. But he spoke with the weight of someone who had been changed by what he'd heard. Sometimes you think you know a person, and sometimes you realize maybe you've never tried. The audience was quiet, not in a bad way, in the kind of way where people listen harder. And for a show built on laughs, that silence felt like a strange kind of applause. After the monologue, Jimmy headed backstage again. The crew met him with soft smiles. Some nodded. One of them simply said, "That was something else." And it was. Later that night, alone again in his dressing room, Jimmy sat down and finally opened the envelope again. He read the words slowly this time, without the pressure of cameras or the pulse of stage lights. The words weren't political. They weren't defensive. They were from one man to another, saying he regretted how far the distance had grown, and how maybe it was time to try something different. "If I ever said something that hurt your family, I'm sorry," one line read. "That wasn't the man I want to be remembered as." Jimmy exhaled, eyes stinging again, not from pain, but from something gentler. Healing, maybe. Understanding. He folded the letter again, more carefully this time, and placed it into a small wooden box on his shelf. Then he sat quietly, letting the silence be enough. Because sometimes the most powerful part of a message isn't the words themselves, but what they leave behind. As the week passed, the buzz surrounding Jimmy's show continued to grow. It was the kind of wave that kept rippling through media outlets and social feeds, but this time it was different. The discussions weren't centered on outrage or harsh opinions. People weren't just throwing political jabs at each other. Instead, they were talking about understanding, about moments when both sides of an argument can come together, not to score points, but to simply listen. Jimmy, sitting in his office late one evening, found himself staring at the same letter again. For days, he had put it away, unsure of what to do with the words. But now he felt the weight of it, the honesty behind it, the courage it took for Donald Trump to write something so human, something so vulnerable, after years of public animosity. It wasn't easy to admit fault. And in his own way, Trump had done just that. He had extended an olive branch not just to Jimmy, but to anyone who had felt the sting of harsh words thrown on television, in rallies, on social media. The phone rang, pulling Jimmy out of his thoughts. It was a private number. He hesitated, unsure whether to pick up. Then curiosity nudged him. He pressed the green button. "Jimmy, it's me," came the familiar voice on the other end. Jimmy sat up straight, recognizing the voice at once. "Mr. Trump?" he asked, his voice soft but surprised. "Yeah, it's me," Trump replied, the tone of his voice more restrained than usual. "I wanted to check in. See how you're doing after all of that." "I know it wasn't easy." The two men fell into an unexpected quiet. It wasn't awkward, just the kind of silence that happens when people are unsure of where to start. Finally, Jimmy broke it. "You really surprised me," he said, his voice softer than he expected. "I didn't expect that kind of message from you. Not after everything we've been through. After everything you've said." Trump was silent for a moment, and then responded with something Jimmy didn't expect. "I know, but I've been thinking. A lot. You're right about something, Jimmy. This division we have, it's got to stop. There's too much anger, too much hate. People are tired of it." Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. This wasn't the man he had spent years sparring with on TV. This was something else, something real. "I think you're right," Jimmy replied quietly, "and it's funny. I wasn't sure I'd ever say this, but I'm glad you reached out." Trump's voice softened even further, almost unrecognizable in its sincerity. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to better. I don't want to keep dividing people, Jimmy." There was a long pause as Jimmy let the words sink in. It was, in some ways, a strange form of peace, an unexpected moment of growth from someone many had written off. "I think we're all just trying to be better, aren't we?" Jimmy finally said. "I don't think any of us have it all figured out, but we can try." Trump chuckled lightly. "Yeah, well, maybe we should try a little harder." The conversation shifted to lighter topics after that. And it felt, for the first time in years, like there was some genuine understanding between them. By the time they hung up, both men were left with the feeling that perhaps this moment could mean something. Not just for them, but for their audiences, their families, and the millions watching, waiting for something other than anger or rhetoric to come through their TV screens. A week later, Donald Trump appeared again on Jimmy's show, not in person but via satellite, in a live segment that was completely unscripted. When the camera turned on, there was a new atmosphere. The crowd, who had grown used to tension-filled debates, was uncertain at first. But then they heard Trump speak, not as the politician or the former president, but as a man who had looked inward. "I just want to say this to everyone watching tonight," Trump began. "It's easy to focus on our differences. It's easy to let the noise take over. But I've learned that maybe the hardest thing to do is listen, and sometimes it's time to listen." The audience was quiet, processing his words. It was a rare sight to see a public figure admit to reflection, to acknowledge his own mistakes. "Jimmy, thank you for hearing me out," Trump continued. "We might not agree on everything, but we can still be civil. We can still be decent. That's something I want to carry forward." The moment felt monumental, like the slow turning of a page, a shift in perspective. Jimmy, sitting across from the camera, couldn't help but feel a sense of pride, not just for himself but for the country. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new. Not a complete overhaul, not a dramatic shift overnight, but a small step forward. And that, in its own way, was a victory. As the night ended, the two men exchanged words of mutual respect. The audience stood, applauding not just the show, but the rare, human interaction they had witnessed. In the end, it wasn't the politics, the jabs, or the headlines that mattered most. It was the message of growth, of listening, and of finding common ground. It was the kind of message the world needed, and for the first time in a long while, it felt possible.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.